gets up and introduces the speaker. But that seems a little bit unorthodox because David is well known to many of us and is a long-standing member of our parish. But that said, I think you will get to hear just a little of David's life today and career. And, oh, by the way, he's just returned from Europe, and he tells me he's somewhere over Hong Kong at the moment, mentally. But I assure you that it does not diminish his keenness, he tells me, to address you this morning. David was born and raised in Vanuatu, graduated from Victoria University with a Bachelor of Laws and a Master of Laws of Arts. He practiced in Wellington and Palmerston Law with his own practice, and I think a brief period back in Vanuatu in between times. He was appointed a family court judge and youth court judge in 1985, and 10 years later he became the principal of the youth court judge, a principal youth court judge. In 2001 he became chief district court judge until his retirement, obviously at a very early age in 2005. He was the chair of the New Zealand Parole Board until 2012. An unenviable task at times. And then he was appointed chair of the Independent Police Conduct Authority, a position he still holds today. Yes, both of those positions I'm sure we give a fair bit of stress at times. He's been a strong advocate for restorative justice and encouraging the fullest involvement of communities to achieve better outcomes. And he's spoken on these matters and presented papers to many conferences here and overseas. He's been awarded the prestigious Bayer Award in Orlando, Florida, for his contribution to international payroll authorities. David was made Distinguished Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit in 2005, and as I'm sure you know, he was knighted in 2009. All of which, of course, makes him eminently qualified to speak to us today on his chosen topic, which is doing justice at personal view. David.
Kia ora whānau, Reverend Fathers, friends, lovely to be here with you. As John has said, my mind is still catching up, so if I go to sleep suddenly during the course of this, I hope you'll carry on talking quietly. Great pleasure for me to see some familiar faces here. Of course, there are a number of you who are on parole still, and there are some others on sentences that cannot afford to be here because you know how vindictive I can be. And yet others have come because breakfast options at home are limited. But it's lovely to see some old friendly faces here across other parts of the work that I've done over the years. Thank you, John, for your introduction, which I found quite disappointing. And the reason for that is I've always thought of introductions as the best part of any address. And I listen to them in the same way that I read character references. Those of you who've employed people in the past know that when you read a character reference, you read for what's not there, not what's said. So if it's glowing, but there's nothing said about honesty, that's what you've got to look for. And that's what I look for in an introduction. So where was the comment, for example, John, about tall, good-looking, and athletic figure? All right, hairstyle. These things, these absences can hurt. There's a famous character just talking about what's missing. There's a famous example of what's missing in respect of a glowing character reference for a chap, which was remarkable in every degree, except this bugger was completely lazy, didn't do any work. And so that was missed out, but at the end, this brilliant summary, which said something like this: any employer who can get John to work for him will be a very fortunate person. You have to read for these things. topics of me where that I speak about some parts of my work around the justice field, which I'm happy to do, how my faith has been involved in that, affected by and affects my work, and of course injunction to try and make it interesting. So I'll do 2/3 of that, but I'm very conscious of the fact that Luke 12 says, "Take no thought about what you shall say, or how you will answer. It will be provided for you." So I'm completely relaxed about that. I like your Bobby, but I've got some notes to guide me. But an old judge friend of mine, some of you will remember him, Judge Mick Brown, who was a great New Zealander, still is, thank God, said to me with this sort of asthmatic way he spoke, he said, "David," he said, "when you're speaking, never ever prepare anything." He said, "That will avoid for you hours of anxiety and distress and despair and concern." And he said, "And then failure will come as a complete surprise." I'm not going to do that. Just a brief and followed history for me, which has been a slightly different journey. I come from Carruthers. We used to call it Paiatua when I was little, but we will learn a bit more about those things these days. My father was Anglican, my mother was Methodist in the days when those things mattered a lot. And so she would go to the Methodist church and we would all go to the Anglican church. And so I was brought up in Anglican with that slightly superior feeling that Anglicans always have about everybody else in the world. Although it is now, of course, a very much a minority church in New Zealand. Just getting that in quickly. I went to a Presbyterian school because there wasn't at that time a secondary school in Paiatua. And then during university, of course, I experimented with a number of different denominations and faiths, mostly depending on which attractive young woman was at that time Jewish or Mormon or anything else. Get me along there. So I'm a mongrel, and I unashamedly mongrel. I had the great good fortune of marrying Catherine Murphy from Kapiti, Taranaki. She was very clear about where she stood in these matters, and because I loved her and still do, I saw no reason for us to be divided in these matters as well. And in 1985, I became Catholic, and that was completed for me by Cardinal Tom in the Cathedral of Wellington. But the funny thing about all that was it was just at the same time I became a judge. And one of the old judges, who hadn't realised that I'd converted, came up to me shortly after I began work. He said, "Thank God that you've joined us." He said, it was getting to the stage where only Catholics were being appointed judges. And his eyes gave all shifty. "We can't have that sort of thing." He said, "It's gone on too long." And my relationship with him was ruined from that point on. So those attitudes still sit there sometimes. One of the funny things about being appointed was from suddenly being called Your Honour, but with great respect from being called Baldy or get it yourself, kid. I imagine it's like a young medical student who for years has been told, "Well, get it yourself, Spotty," and suddenly it's "Yes, doctor, how can I help you?" So I've been a judge now for nearly 30 years. I still have a judicial warrant, although I don't sit anymore. It was a strange journey to be called Your Honour, still called Your Worship by people over 80. I sat for a while as a judge in Samoa and Vanuatu, and there they called me Your Lordship, which has got a nice ring to it. Seems appropriate in many ways, more like a bishop, without having to work too hard. And only once, on one wonderful day, I was called Your Majesty. But that was at a mental health hearing. And the psychiatrist, who was a friend of mine, put the patient up to it. Particularly the last few years as chair of the parole board and now doing this job, I've been called many more accurate things and robust things and unsatisfactory things. And I've had more threats and more abuse, you'd be pleased to hear, than I've ever had before in my entire life, including at one stage in Paraparu, we have the police around the house, and an officer inside because a contract had been taken out on my life. And that happens, unfortunately, it's the darkest side of what happens in New Zealand sometimes. It's never worried me particularly because I've always had the strong view that I'll die when God wants me to, not when some bloody mongrel mob decides it's going to happen. But of course it's worrying that family and children are threatened as they are sometimes too. But wherever you go, where I go, the small town of Pahiatua goes with you. And a few years ago I spoke at an international conference in London. It was in Westminster, and it was so big, this hall, that they had two screens, only small, I like to think athletic and packed, etc., but two big TV screens beside you so that they could project the figure, the small bald figure onto the screen so people could see. And as I walked up to the stage, thinking as I walked up, the hell am I doing here? I'm just a little boy from Pahiatua. Suddenly they flashed onto the screens a map of New Zealand with an arrow pointing at Pahiatua. And someone had done their homework and was pointing out where I came from. And I was quite moved by that. And I told this international audience that if they were thinking of visiting Pahiatua, that they should think of it as being up a bit from Ekatahuna and across from Pongaroa. And I think that helped at the moment. It was received in respectful silence. That conference was on restorative justice, which has been a passion of mine for a long time. And near where I spoke, there was a flagstone in the middle of Westminster Hall. And it was a plaque which recorded the spot where St. Thomas More stood when he was sentenced to death following his trial for treason. And I stood on that plaque through odd feeling. Would have been much odder if you'd been St. Thomas More, I imagine, although he had a very good sense of humour. Well, we got the sentencing remarks of the judge, and I thought you'd be interested to hear what was said then, because it contrasts with what we're able to do now in an unsatisfactory way. Here's the sentencing remarks for Moore. Sir Thomas More, you are to be drawn on a hurdle through the city of London to Tyburn, there to be hanged, until ye be half dead. After that, cut down and yet alive, your bowels to be taken out of your body and burned before you, your privy parts cut off, your head cut off, your body to be hewn. Hewn, such a lovely word, we hardly use that these days in the courts, and I do think there's a place for it. Your body to be hewn into 4 parts, and your head and body to be set at such places as the king shall assign. Now that's a real sentence. I've often thought what a difference it would make to illegal parking in Wellington. Just by way of example, we can just a bit of fun pass that sort of sentence. You'll know that Henry VIII was a very merciful, sort of softy sort of king, would not have been popular with a sensible sentencing trust, and he commuted Thomas More's sentence to be heading only, which was wishy-washy, softy, wet bus tickets. It was quite rightly criticised at the time. And I've always thought that if they'd allowed his head to be buried with his body, in Australia that would have been called restorative justice. I mentioned St. Thomas More deliberately because he's the patron saint of lawyers and politicians. Pretty motley lot of focus people. And of course he embodies principles of integrity, constancy, steadfastness, faith, and practice what he preached, of course, and has died for it. I've spoken about Sir Thomas More on several other occasions, and I've always thought that his stand, which was courageous in principle, was based more on fear of damnation and eternal hellfires than what we now call the response that we are required to make to a loving God and the love of Christ. But that, of course, was then, and he we still turn to him as an example of integrity and a life lived by principle, not by expedience. And it's relevant to my theme with you today, because most of us have had to suffer from time to time with doubts and subtleties as we try to work out the most honest course to take. And we all face the dangers of compromises, confusions, ambiguities, which can produce a more comfortable answer, but sometimes a wrong one. And I've seen lots of examples of this of others in my life. 2 or 3 examples of that. I was involved in the introduction of some legislation called the Personal Property Rights legislation. Enduring powers of attorney, everyone should have one, absolutely essential. When that was being debated, a number of judges made it clear that they would resign if they had to have jurisdiction which required them to order the sterilisation of others who were incapable. And these were not just Christian judges, but also 2 Jewish judges whose people had suffered during the Second World War. So they had very strong principled views about this, which they made clear, and which they were prepared to sacrifice their social economic position. I remember closer to home, for a while I was the judge in charge of Carruthers, and was a senior social worker there. He was to give evidence in a case involving a dispute between Maori and Samoan families, a dispute over a child, and he had to write a report about the respective strengths, etc., from the child's point of view. And unfortunately, there was a very strong gang influence in this case, and he was visited at home by a number of gang members who made it clear what he would suffer personally and what his children would suffer personally if he did not produce a report which was favourable to the side they wanted. So he was surrounded by these people. The threats were real, against not just him, but against his family. But he didn't hesitate. He gave, I thought, exceptionally honest, very reliable, fair evidence, changed not one jot by the threats that had been made against him. It was a fact of real courage, because outside the courtroom, as we were hearing it, you could hear the howls of some of the people. And this man will be known to some of you, because he became again a Catholic priest, and that was Father Morgan. Anyone know him? And I think of him, older man now, with great affection and admiration, because he, in spite of real personal difficulties, acted with enormous integrity, and I salute him. And I've seen in my time, 8 years as chairman of parole board, prison officers throughout the country who've received threats to family members regarding drugs and access to cell phones and so forth by prisoners. Easy to do, just talk to the guards, say, understand the children who live at 22C Barring Street, Carruthers, might be in trouble unless you let this go through, that sort of thing. So it's real, it's not just fanciful. And not only have those people stood out against those threats, most of them, but they've gone on and informed others who needed to know. And I, again, salute the courage. A friend who was a lawyer in a senior firm, he thought the firm was acting improperly about tax matters. He complained about it, wasn't listened to. He complained to the Law Society about it, was excluded from the law firm, ostracised by this group, threatened with enormous claims for damages, and stuck to his ground. And now, today, as I do this job with the police force, we're actually very lucky in this country. Things go wrong, of course, 12,500 police officers, and some of them will not always behave as they should. But I see every day young police officers, in spite of enormous pressure of peer group and the sticking together philosophy, which is actually protective for police, very important part of it, don't hesitate to speak out strongly when they think that others are acting inappropriately and particularly involving undue force or violence. And we've got Joe here, I know, representing the police force today, but I just want to acknowledge the fact that although there's some things that go wrong, and sometimes we have been critical of them, and we will, that's the job. In fact, we're very well served in New Zealand by very people of great integrity who will not hesitate to say what is true. And it's no coincidence to me that often I have found that these people of faith who make these stands because they have an understanding of principle. The other thing that I salute in this country, because I've seen it so often, is the way we do things differently. I've had the benefit of visiting systems all around the world now, justice systems, parole, prison systems, and now the work I'm doing, to see what we can learn. But actually we have our own way of doing things in New Zealand which we ought to celebrate. And it sometimes is funny, but it's our way. I've got a couple of examples just to show you. One of them, true story, two young men in the far north who decided, one was 15, one was 17, decided that they would rob a bank. Short of money, they'd seen on DVDs, this is what you do when you're short of money. So they decided in a small country area that they would rob the local bank. And they knew that disguise was crucial, very clever boys these, and that recognition would be difficult for them. So they borrowed some dryers of own those big coats, gumboots. They got 4 balaclavas and they turned them back to front and eventually got holes which were parallel with their eyes. One of them had a BB gun, sawn off 22, which didn't work. And they shuffled them behind the bank of the single street little town in north of New Zealand. And they waited until things were quiet. Actually, we're always quiet there, but they waited anyway. There were only 4 or 5 in the bank, one bank in the town. And then they burst in through the door. And the older boy, 17, said, "Right, yous, all of yous, hit the floor now." And then he said, "Not you, Auntie." Where else in the world? They upset people, they really bad behaviour, and they suffered for it eventually. But there's the sort of respect there which you kind of think could be built on, and was. Another example, and that's a Kiwi thing. You know, there are many stories like this, which are our way. There was a prison, just a couple of years ago now, regional prison, where the prisoners decided that they had some legitimate grievances, and so they escaped from their cell block and they got up on the roof, 2-story roof, and they said they weren't coming down until their reasonable grievances were met. And in many countries I've been to, that would have been dealt with immediately and brutally. In Singapore, for example, where I was involved in setting up a parole system, they've got a group of people who are trained to deal with these situations, heavily armoured, those big rattans, the big angry canes. They would have gone up there and whacked them off the roof and there would have been no hesitation. In other places they would have set up a machine gun nest, given them a gun in 5 minutes, and then they would have dealt with them in a different way. So there are brutal ways of doing that to show who's in power and who's not. But not in New Zealand. In New Zealand, on this occasion, thank God, what the officers did was they got a hose out, and as evening fell, they got the pressure ramped up and they hosed them on top of the roof so that they'd be a little bit wet for the night. It was a cold night. And in the morning, they got a barbecue and they wheeled it up underneath the lit it up, and they started cooking bacon and eggs and onions. And after a while, the boys started negotiating. Well, who wouldn't? Okay, we'll come down, but we're not going to go to Paris, okay? Nah. Right, we'll come down, but no solitary, okay? Nah. Eventually, they came down for a pie and lemonade. And then, because we're actually fundamentally a decent society, and there's no longer any blackmail involved, some reasonable people got together, looked at what the grievances were to see if there's anything in them. So it wasn't just a matter of we won, you lost, back you go. It was more thoughtful than that. And I think there are Kiwi ways of doing things which we should celebrate, because no one was hurt and it was successful in a way. Here's another little example, just seen the CCTV of this, and it was two young guys, prisoners, decided that they would escape. And these guys were not in the genius category, nor really close to it. They were in touch with another friend who had a van, and they were going out on work patrol, and they'd go out in crocodiles, two by two officers on either side. And they had arranged that the van would be near by at a certain point. One of them had a bottle. He'd throw the bottle to distract the guards, and then these two guys would head off into the van, and away they go. Brilliant plan, very cleverly worked out, almost foolproof. Almost foolproof. On the day, there'd been a bit of an upset the night before, and so the officers decided that each of the two would be handcuffed together. So our little friends were handcuffed. All of the group were 2 by 2. But it was all set up. So the van will be there, we just run for it together. So they did. The moment came, one of them had the bottle, threw the bottle, and off they went. And I've seen the CCTV of this. It's Keystone, you can feel it coming. Keystone cop stuff. They came to a lamppost. They each ran around the one way. They came together, completely entangled because their hand was still around the lamppost, hit the floor. The van driver saw what was happening and took off. And the interesting thing is, on the CCTV, no one came to them for quite some time because the officers were on the ground laughing. And so were the rest of the prisoners. I'm very keen on restorative justice, keeping a long time. Because I could talk very long, right? I'm very keen on restorative justice. And you probably know that it's really under the radar way. It's now being incorporated, restorative practices are, in the education system of New Zealand. Over half of New Zealand secondary schools are now using restorative practices, that is community problem solving, to deal with discipline problems in schools and to avoid exclusions, etc. Highly successful, pioneered here in New Zealand, now spreading rapidly throughout the world. So amazing revolution going on around that. In the parole pre-sentencing area, which I've been involved in, hugely successful in the right cases, because there are wrong cases too, and sometimes that would be complete failure. But now this is spreading rapidly throughout this country. I'm delighted that Catholic schools are at the head of this. Some of them are now fully restorative in the way that they're incorporating practices. You know, the educationalists are, I think, the unsung heroes of our country, and they need every support and help we can give them. And this way of working is, I think, exceptionally good. We've now got the first chair in restorative justice in the world, and no surprise that the first professor, Chris Marshall, is a Christian minister here at Victoria University, supported by a large number of government departments, and some of them are surprises. The Defence Department is strongly now involved in restorative justice practices in respect of stuff that goes wrong for them. So, very, very interesting. And I've been really impressed at the way faith-based communities in New Zealand have adopted what's called circles of support and accountability. We've got a number of prisoners in this country who are really difficult to release from prison if they don't have any family support, often because of the terrible things they've done or the terrible way in which families have been hurt. And these circles, faith-based circles, have been formed to provide support for them, following some practices developed by the Mennonites in Canada. So real integrity, Christian integrity involved in forming circles to commit themselves permanently to the support of these very difficult people. My own involvement in restorative justice, which I think incorporates gospel values in a significant, impressive way, came as a result of two women I met in the United Kingdom some years ago, both of whom had daughters murdered separately, different daughters. And they were not able to get any peace for themselves or to look after themselves or other members of the family until they'd had this sort of meeting with their family, the prisoner and prisoner's family, to get answers to questions about what had happened and why and so forth. And both of them were enormously impressed about the way way in which they described that didn't change the tragedy for them, but it changed the way in which they were able to deal with it. And we've had huge amounts of happening here about all that. We've had our own successes, and one of my favourite stories about is a young man that we saw down in the South Island who'd been part of a satanic cult group years ago. And this evil group had kidnapped a young guy, that held him, and they tortured him in accordance with the tenets of this cult, and then they killed him. And in prison, this guy became a Christian and showed that it was real, because some of this is done just for the benefit of parole boards and others, but sometimes, thank God, it's very real. And this guy changed his behaviour, his whole approach to other people. And eventually he had a restorative justice meeting with the family of the boy who was killed. And what really impressed me, because we have a transcript of it all, was that the sister of the boy said at the end of it, she said this: "I've been in terror of you being released from prison, enormous fear of you. It stopped me from what I wanted to do with my life." She'd been at university and jacked it in because she couldn't carry on after her brother was killed. "Today I'm getting rid of that fear. I've never wanted it. It's ruined my life so far. But today I'll start my own life again. I don't have any fear of you anymore. I'll walk out of here without it." And she said, and this happens so often, which was humbling, she said, "I wish you well," which is more than I could do. We hear those sort of stories again and again, in the right cases at the right time, because there are others that would not be successful. But it seems to me that it's a victim's right to have that sort of meeting, not offender's right. It's the victim's right to have it for those sorts of reasons, and there are plenty of examples. Another example of restorative practices in a wider sense. A couple of years ago, Catherine and I went to Rwanda to lead some workshops with neighbouring Commonwealth countries and Rwanda on prison overcrowding. You know, Rwanda had this terrible genocide, about 1 million people slaughtered in a very short time, beyond words. What amazed me was that the workshops, which involved judges and justice people from both Rwanda and these other countries, instead of talking about overcrowding, they all wanted to talk about restorative justice, because they were used to this way of working in village communities and communities of their countries, and were keen to know how that could move into a modern justice system, because all the pressure to have all the usual rights involved systems today. And so it became a discussion really about restorative justice. And in Rwanda, the setting up of what they call Kakacha courts, the community village courts, was in fact a restorative response to the tragedy of that country. Hugely interesting, very, the jury's still out. There are real problems still for Rwanda, both internally and externally. But one has to respect the enormous resilience of those people and the desire they had to build something for their children out of chaos and disaster. And I was enormously impressed. In fact, very recently I just had a request from a young guy who's in charge of the Kakacha courts there, who wants us to sponsor him for some more university training. So if anyone's keen on being involved with that with me, I'd be very pleased to hear from you, because I think we have an obligation to help young leaders of that country for the future. This is largely a Catholic country. Every Sunday we went to Mass, and the Masses all day were packed with people. And as you looked around them, there were people with one leg sometimes, one arm missing, machete slashes across the face, terrible, terrible wounds. Kids there bringing up kids, because both parents had been killed. And yet, in the church, the singing and the exuberance, the joy was overwhelming, humbling that people were trying to get on with their lives and to build a future from such an awful tragedy. And on one occasion, I remember there was a visiting choir from Uganda singing in that way that we sometimes see you do, that you sway as you sing or something. So I'm trying to do it myself. I don't have a problem like that. The only thing holding me back. But this chorus, a woman from Uganda was singing, and at the end of the Mass, in a sort of exuberance, they sang the Alleluia chorus from Messiah. And I'm not a crier, I seen and done some terrible things, which I'll seek forgiveness. But I couldn't see for tears during that was overwhelming experience. Just as a different experience, earlier this year I went to Taiwan to give a series of lectures on restorative justice, and they told me they have a restorative process for the death penalty in Taiwan. And you have to ask what it is. And they said, oh, well, we have this restorative process. If the prisoner, the condemned person, will agree to donate his organs, he gets shot in the head. And if he doesn't agree, he gets shot in the heart. It's all in the definition, I think. I'm still trying to work that out. Anyway, it's a great comfort to me to know that New Zealand was judged first equal recently as with Sweden, most non-corrupt country in the world. We know there are problems of definition. We know that sometimes people let us down. But it is something which is so important to all of us in this country, and that we need to regard as a precious treasure to be guarded against all the time, and that we all have an obligation in doing that. When that award was made, we were visited by, about a dozen countries coming up to find out what our processes were for avoiding corruption. And they came to see us as part of the police oversight stuff, and saw other people too. Missing the entire point that the culture of this country is the thing that matters. It's the culture of all of us here who think about fairness and what is right and try and do what is right even when things are difficult. And it's that culture, rather than the organisations and things that my group does, that makes the difference. It's a shared value which I think we need to rejoice in. I've come with a lot of quick things if I've got time. Have I got time? I have. Okay. I want to tell you one of the terrors of the work I now do is I'm in charge of an independent Crown entity, which means all sorts of government reporting, and some of you will have had experience of all this. It's extraordinary. It comes as a shock. I know it's necessary, but it takes something to get through it. And also the language which is used is extraordinary. So a whole lot of examples about the language, the bureaucracy language which I now have to be involved in. But here's other use of language. What we do quite often with the police misconduct stuff, as Joe will know, is that we very often send back to police something which has gone wrong and ask them to do it again. And very often they get a senior officer from another part of the country to come and repeat it. And we did this with a case recently, and I got a report from a senior police officer down in South Island who'd interviewed at our request a young constable who'd been involved in a very nasty incident. And this is his report. This is the senior officer. It is apparent from our conversations that under increased or heightened arousal, Constable X suffers from perceptual narrowing, inverted commas, medical condition obviously, and therefore has difficulty in making quality considered decisions. His actions become automatic. This is commonly referred to as red mist. Be careful about you in future. Discussions reveal that Constable X has classic symptoms of this form of reaction to stress: tunnel vision, inappropriate shouting of directions, inability to hear anything else, rushing at things, making decisions too quickly, and inability to recognise and consider all relevant inputs. And then the inspector added, but by no means is this intended to be derogatory. So, I wonder what he'd say if it was intended to be derogatory. And here's another, this is like really common stuff, like I'll put you led to the parole board from a prisoner who decided not to come and pursue parole for very good reasons. Just so we're clear about this, I am not going to be attending your stinking anti-intellectual parole. I am hereby waiving my parole hearing because you are cretins. You're not interested in hearing about parole, you're a bunch of liberal barnyard animals with delusions of grandeur. No, he's not on that one. He was on to it. You have kept me in prison for nearly 7 years past my parole eligibility date to satisfy your bastard instincts, which are nothing but a burden on humanity and only gratify your own unsound self-interest. And the elaborate, I'm going to censor the next bit because he's elsewhere. I have not forgotten the ways you've acted in bad faith, the way you falsified transcripts, inappropriate reports, your rude and degrading comments towards me, your inability to be honest and accountable, your reasonless requirements. I'm convinced you don't have a brain between you and that you represent a heinous parasitic burden on society in this country. You are semi-civilised, pretentious morons. See, again, he was on to it. None of it's censored, but that doesn't excuse anything. In my way of thinking, it's not allowable that you have, the way you viewed my parole eligibility, you have prevented the community from having a chance with me. And you think you can take credit for that? To put it politely, which he then doesn't, you are all a bunch of Liberal government muppets who perversely think you represent the community of New Zealand. The truth is you're nothing to do with New Zealand. Good riddance to you all. Thanks for nothing, societal rejects. And then he finished, yours sincerely. And if he'd been a senior police officer, he would have added, but none of this is to be taken personally. Time's moving on, so I'm going to cut short what else I was going to say. I want to finish by saying that I am conscious in everything that I do of the need for guidance and prayer, and you'll be interested in the number of Christian judges, lawyers who have the same approach to this. I have a particular person in mind who's now dead, but a friend of mine who's a judge, a lovely man. He told me he tried to see the face of Christ in every person he came before him. He was, which I thought was humbling and true of him. Incidentally, he was a guy, he was quite English in his characteristics and didn't like the seamier side of life. So sometimes judging was quite difficult for him. And he once told me that he had a jury case and the jury come back with questions if they've got some things that need to be answered. And one of the questions was, could he define sexual intercourse? And that was a difficulty for my rather sensitive friend. He said, it's very, very hard to define, David. He said, but I know it when I see it. So I've spoken generally about something which is inexhaustible, really. You'll be pleased to hear that at last in New Zealand, prison numbers seem to be falling, crime rates going down, except for domestic violence, which is an issue all of its own. And no one is quite clear why that's happening. And there's various theories about that. Some people say it's to do with demographic, which probably is true. Others say whānau ora, police say prevention first, which is clearly having an effect. There are some academics in America who are convinced that abortion is a part to play in the way in which crime rates are now going down. And then there is the Australian view. I spoke about this to the Director of Prisons in Queensland, our prison rates going down at last. And he said, yeah, well, I'll tell you why that's happening. I've got all your bastards over here. It's sad there's a bit of truth in that. Let me just finish by saying this, and I haven't rehearsed this, so it may come out clumsy, but it's genuine. I just want to say something about you guys in our parish community, which I rejoice in. I sometimes the jobs that I've done have been hard, and sometimes they've been extremely unpopular, and sometimes I've made mistakes, and sometimes I've felt very much alone. I never feel that when I go to our church and I'm part of the community. I look around for people that I know very well and other people I don't know, but I see older members of our community who are not well themselves, struggling lovingly, looking after spouses and other members of the family who are going through difficult times. And I just think there are saints amongst our church community who are never celebrated and never acknowledged. And know some of the worries that some of the people have, because I know some of the lives that they've had. I know the worries about money, about money for the family, all of that. And yet here we are, a whole group of people trying to help support each other. And I know of people who are nobly, whilst unwell themselves, caring for others lovingly in response to a loving God. And I rejoice in that. I think we are so lucky to have you guys. And I want to conclude what I have to say today by saying thank you for all of that, because I find it enormously sustaining and impressive. And God bless you all.
As usual, David blows me away with his humility and his frankness and his ability to convey feelings and emotions. But David, thank you very much for that. Any questions, Gemma? We have 5 minutes for questions if we have any.
No.
How?
More in the way of an observation, David. When we first started communicating with you to try and get you here as a speaker nearly 2 years ago, as an indication of how busy you are, we kept on missing each other. But we did eventually pick on a date. I think it was about late last year or sometime like this date a year ago. And you had to ring up and say, I'm sorry, Howard, but I can't make it. He said, I've got to go to China. And I said, that's all right, David, we'll find another day. I said, what are you doing in China? He said, I'm going to talk about restorative justice. And I said, I didn't know they had restorative justice in China. And that's good, because the flash said, yes, they send them to their ancestors. David, I've really enjoyed your talk this morning, and it's been well worth the wait. Thank you.
Any other questions, gentlemen? Italy.
I've got one, David. Did you experience the early 70s with the magistrates of Wellington? We had 6 Catholic magistrates in the early 70s.
Yeah.
And Jim Weeks was always saying to some budding lawyer down there, Mr. So-and-so, don't appeal to my sectarian bias.
Well, I remember those days, and I remember Sir James Wicks, because he was so senior to me. He holds a world record for reserved decisions. I took him home from a function once, something like 10, 15 years after he'd retired. He said, you know, David, he said, I've got a decision at home which I've never delivered. And then he died about 3 years after that. So it's never been, so the record continues. No one's ever beaten it. He's a lovely man. Yeah. And those are the days. All of the judges, magistrates should have been Catholic, but there's been the odd Baptist.
Mind you, Ben Scully didn't do it right sometimes. On one occasion, I was working upstairs in the number 4 courtroom, which is all gone now, and we had an adjournment, and I was in Ben's room, and he said, come on, Hanley, open that door. And when I opened the door, he said, let's get rid of this lying bastard. The whole courtroom could hear what he was saying.
He was unique, I think. Yeah.
Thanks. Over in Sweden or over that area there, I believe they've halved their prison sentences. They've trained the people into alternative things, and they've had less reoccurrence of crime. Is that working? Is it becoming well known?
It's a really interesting question and complicated. Although we have there's a guy called Professor John Pratt, who's just got an international award for work on the Scandinavian system, which picks up those things we talked about. Yes, the prison population is really, really low in those Scandinavian countries. I've been to Finland, particularly, look at systems there. You know, the interesting thing is the homicide rate is still really, really high. And it's a different society. Alcohol, suicide rates are enormous, but the prison and offending rate is low. And in Finland they got there because they had a meeting of media, politicians, academics, prison people and others have all agreed that they were over-imprisoning, using prisons too much, uselessly, because people mostly come out, and they then decided they would clamp down on the numbers that would go into prison. And it's been hugely successful, although they have these other statistics I mentioned. They've also got problems with the Russian mafia and so forth in the prisons, which are quite disputed. So yes, it's very successful, it's different. If you've seen that film, what's it, the Dragon Lady, the other there's a practice there, if you're sentenced to prison, you then have to wait for a room to become available. So it's a slightly different culture, but there are some things that we could borrow very usefully. And I'm absolutely convinced we're overusing imprisonment in this country, and it doesn't serve the national good, and takes a lot of money that all of us wish to use in different ways. So things to be done, there always will be.
Bill?
Yes, as a young court reporter, I well remember Magistrate Ben Scully. On one occasion, he often liked to make a joke at the prisoner's expense, and one prisoner put back at him, made a bit of a smart back, and Ben Scully had fined him £5, and Ben just says, £10, but your worship, £15. And then again was the case of Paddy Jepson, one of the town drunks. In those days, if you were found drunk, you could be pulled before the court. With Paddy Jepson's 100th conviction, and Ben Scully let him off for the course of that time, and no conviction.
Well, it's just interesting to just pick up from that, because sometimes we wonder in this country how we can get back to the gentler, more civilised, more inclusive society that some of us think we can remember. And we've actually done that before. At the moment, the most imprisoned ethnic group in New Zealand are Maori, 51% in prison against 14% population, 14-15. But in 160 years ago, the most imprisoned ethnic group in this country were Irish. And is that the case now? It's not. So what changed, and what do we have to do again if we're learning from history? It's about fairness, about education, about opportunities, social mobility, those sorts of things, which we need just to think about if we want to change the face of this country. And we can do it. I'd like to thank David Carruthers for once being...
Two more questions on that. Sorry, another thing. Yeah.
How are you doing? David, as a sentencing judge, you just said that prisons are overpopulated. When you were sentencing anyone in prison, is that revenge for what they've done? Is it for the protection of society? Is it for the education of the prisoner? What is your motive for sending someone to prison as a sentencing judge then if they're overpopulated?
The answer is not as simple as you'd like to think. There are guidelines for sentences set by higher courts, and sort of like tariff for certain things, aggravated robbery and rape and so forth. And every court in Parliament stipulates, the only way it can to judges, what those sentences should be. So messages are sent by way of legislation to judges. Sometimes people run out of options, and so those who have been doing community work or community sentences who breach those end up going to prison because there are no other options. I think there's a lack of options, one thing. Secondly, it should, I'm sure, be for the protection of the rest of us. And there are some people in prison whom I've seen who should never be out of prison. You need to be kept safely in a civilised way, who should never be released. But they're a minority. Most will come out, most will be part of our communities again. And I've met lots of people whom I've released on parole who've gone on with their lives really successfully, including, we've got about 267 murderers on parole at the present time, most of them living really good lives again. So, is it helpful? There are some cases where it gives people a chance to dry out, to think about their lives, to make some changes and do some things in the future. I think my objection mostly is the short-term prisoners, of whom there are many 3 months, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, who don't get any educational programs, who make friends in prison, who come out west for the experience rather than better. And so a range of other options ought to be developed, as it has been in Scandinavian countries. As for my part of that, I've made the mistakes that I'm sorry about. Actually, just talking about that for a second, because I've been a judge for 30 years, I'm now being able to see some of the mistakes I've made. It's the failures that come back to haunt me, not successes, if there were any. I've seen kids in prison whom I saw in the youth court years before, so we clearly missed the opportunity of changing them. I've seen kids in prison who were part of custody cases, like that was the family court judge 25 years ago. So, there's sometimes you feel personally responsible for what happened because you didn't see it correctly at the time. So I've made, just telling you my confidence, don't let it go any further. Please don't tell any politicians. I've made lots of mistakes, I've learned as I've gone along. I think we need to develop more options, so that there are more options to imprisonment, because I don't see it as being all that helpful, except in some cases.
Thank you. One final question, Greg.
A catchy one. Are they my own teeth? Yes.
I was just thinking, it's great to hear you say that you're human like the rest of us, that you've made mistakes. We all make mistakes. Where a lot of us fall down is we don't acknowledge our own mistakes, and we make more mistakes covering them up. Just wanted to acknowledge that from what you just said. My other question or sort of query around is, what place does the laws that have been set have when, I sort of perceive the laws are there to protect us all, but I think, are we moving a little bit closer towards the laws being put in place to actually control us rather than actually protect us?
That's a really big subject, and everyone has their own views about that. The people that I'm involved with, like the Ombudsman's Office and the Privacy Commissioner, talk about our now being a surveillance country where there's a lot of information held by organisations about each of us. That's an international movement, probably unstoppable, I would have thought. So that's happened here in New Zealand as it has in every other country in the world. Is it for the purpose of control? Well, I don't feel control, but these things can creep on you. I think I'm no better qualified to answer that than anyone else is here. It's a good question. It's a question for all of us. And particularly in about a month's time when we vote.
David, we'll let you off the hook.
Thank you.
First of all, Nick, would like to say something to you.
David, I'm not sure how to address you, whether it's your lordship or
Majesty.
His Majesty. Just a little bit of background on us before I thank David officially. This I think from Keith, where this is our 9th year of breakfasts, and our overriding aim for our small group is that we are to help ourselves and other men make substantial progress in our spiritual lives. So that's why we run the breakfasts. We also have a prayer group, and from time to time we have special events. And so David was asked to speak, not because of his teeth or his baldness, but because we knew he would add immensely to our own spiritual lives. And restorative justice, which he said comes straight from the gospel, I can see that, and I think, with understanding, David is instrumental in New Zealand in getting it off the ground. So it's a huge feather in his cap, and it's made an amazing difference to many of the people in the world. I'd just like to say that, not knowing David, I took from his address that not only is he humorous and humble, but he's, I think, courageous and compassionate, and that comes through, and that's one of the great Christian traits. So I can only say that I think David deserves all the accolades he gets, and I've immensely enjoyed today, and I think we all have. We haven't had as many people here for men's breakfast before. I think we've done marvellously, so thank you so much, David. And I love the way you ended up quoting the judge saying the idea is to see Christ in everybody, and I think it's a great lesson for us all. God bless.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you once again, David. Just a couple of things before we wind up, gentlemen. Men's breakfast has gone through an evolving process after the last 3 to 4 years, even though we've been going for 9 years. And we've had a change of people who've been on the committee. So what I'm going to do is frighten the hell out of all of them and ask them to stand up and just introduce them so you know who is on the committee. So Nick, can we start with you, please? Nick Marr. Next one. Jared. John Butterfield. Howard Walker. Jeff Gibbs. Glenn. And Fritz. Thank you, gentlemen. These are the people that have guided this through for the last 9 years. But there's also another gentleman who went into hospital on Thursday for an operation yesterday, Pat Hockey. Pat is in danger. No, I don't think he was actually in any danger, but however, he's out of danger, he's had his operation.
No.
And so if we can just remember
No.
Patrick in our prayers, please.
The machine broke down. They anaesthetised him and got him in the theatre, and then the machine broke down.
They didn't want him, did they? Spirit of justice, hidden tail. No, thank you, Glenn. Okay, just a couple of other things, gentlemen. The next men's breakfast is on the 8th of November here in the hall. So put that in your diaries. The guest speaker will be Bishop Justin Duckworth. We have a ladies' breakfast here on the 18th of October. And we'll hear more about that as the time gets closer. And we will finish up with a song from Roland Luff Alley. So when you leave, please can you give us a hand to put the chairs and things away. Thank you, gentlemen. God bless you all.
Has been our start. You believe that? Our God, thank you for your life, which allows us to see the many good things you have given us. Thank you for each of us here, for this meal before us, for the cooks out the back, for our home, and especially for your love. Help us to share your love and the light with all we meet today. Amen. Amen.
That goes to the doctor for his yearly checkup. Everything is fine, said the doctor. You're doing okay for your age? For my age question, Sam, I'm only 75. Do you think I'll ever make it to 80? Well, said the doctor, do you drink or you smoke? No, Sam replied. Do you eat fatty meats or sweets? No, said Sam. I'm very careful about what I eat. How about your activities? Do you engage in thrilling behaviours like speeding or skiing? No, said Sam, taken back. What about sex? He says, that's long gone. I'd never engage in dangerous activities either. Well, said the doctor, then why in the world would you want to live to 80?